Europe is in chaos. Thousands lie dead after decades of religious turmoil, and there is now an encroaching threat in the form of the Ottomans. Great riches have been made and remain to be made through the discovery of this brave new world of gold, jade, and jungle. The Western world lies on a precipice. Does it fall further into the abyss of its medieval past, or does it rise and develop into the most powerful continent on Earth? Hello. This series will teach you in detail the period of 1547 to 1603, with an English-centric focus on the Tudor dynasty. This began in 1485 with Henry VII. In order to gain a decent perspective on why things are happening as they do, we will give a preamble on the last 100 years of European history. This won't be in too much detail, so don't get your knickers in a twist if it isn't detailed enough for you. I also understand that some of the sources used in this particular video itself won't be the most reliable, since I don't own books on Henry VII or Henry VIII, but it does the job for a quick look. Later episodes will be far more reliable since I own a bunch of books on them, but honestly this is necessary so we can gain a decent idea of what the hell's going on. After some 30 years of war between the House of York and the House of Lancaster, which we know as the War of the Roses, in 1485 Henry VII fought and won against King Richard III at the Battle of Bosworth Field. Richard died as a result of this battle, and Henry VII became the new King of England. Henry then spent a few years trying to consolidate his rule. First of all, as he promised, he shrewdly married Elizabeth of York, thus joining the houses of York and Lancaster and attempting to mend the schism in England. He also strengthened the administration and rule of the crown. However, in spite of this, there was a number of rebellions after he seized the crown, as you would expect. There was the last stand of the Yorkists in 1487, which was a rebellion under the Earl of Lincoln. This began in Ireland and made its way to England, and luckily for Henry, he wrecked it at the Battle of Stoke Field. After this rebellion was quashed, he had the ringleaders all executed, but was wisely kind to their subordinates. He didn't want to make the people of England think he was as Machiavellian or tyrannical as Richard III is often interpreted as. Safe to say that went pretty well. However, there are others as well. Before this, there was an averted rebellion as well, in the form of the Stafford family planning to rebel. But Henry put an end to this before much happened, which resulted in the execution of Humphrey Stafford, the older of the two plotters. There are also other rebellions that have nothing to do with the War of the Roses. In 1489, there was a rebellion in Yorkshire over taxation Henry levied to pay for war to prevent Brittany from falling into French hands. No major battles were fought, although there was some turmoil and the first leader was executed. The second leader was a wimp and he fled to Burgundy. Henry's response was surprisingly kind, as he forgave the rebels and didn't make them pay the taxes, which hampered his ability to act in Brittany. Later on, in 1497, there was a bunch of rebellions in the southwest. The first was due to how people were discontented with taxes and forced loans that Henry levied against them to defend against Scotland. It could also have been potentially the concept of Cornish nationalism, which was then very much alive. You must not forget, Cornwall had a separate language, different culture, and different way of doing things from the rest of the country. This was a large-scale rebellion, where the rebels advanced up the country and fought small skirmishes with royal forces. However, this came to a head at the Battle of Deptford Bridge, where Henry crushed the rebels. He seems to have been much harsher on this rebellion, executing, enslaving, and heavily fining surviving rebels. Then, Henry went on to pacify the West. The other was the issue of Perkin Warbeck, a pretender to the English throne. He had caused trouble for Henry starting in 1491, where he made a bunch of unsuccessful invasions of Ireland with the support of Scotland. There was another in 1496, which was pretty unsuccessful too. However, the issue with him came to a head where he invaded the southwest in 1497, after the First Rebellion. However, since royalist forces were in the area, he was quickly defeated and executed. However, in how he ruled, it would seem that he was much less about war and growing his territory, and more about consolidating his gains within the English kingdom. He restored the wealth of the Exchequer, mostly through making the tax system far more efficient than it had been, and strengthening his financial administration. He also tried as hard as he could to dodge wars while he was doing this, although he had to do some fighting with France and Scotland. He also began an alliance with the Habsburgs in Spain, which would become a motif throughout this period. He also fought strongly for English trade too. Henry VII died in 1509 of tuberculosis. Overall, it seems that he did pretty well considering his circumstances. Then, we move on to Henry VIII, the man who we all know had 6 wives. What happened in his reign not only changed England, but also the world. Initially not expected to be king, he eventually became heir to fill the position that his brother Arthur left. Arthur died of disease in 1502, and Henry had to step in to fill his position. He married his brother's ex, Catherine of Aragon, who produced Mary Tudor, but no successful living male heir. Luckily for him, though, there was a large event in Europe which gave him a way out. In 1517, Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses to the door of a Wittenberg chapel, and from there history changed, but we will elaborate upon that later on. Initially, Henry opposed this, but later he changed his mind. This is probably the thing he is memorised the most for, beside for his wives. In 1534, he passed the Act of Supremacy, which made him the head of the Church of England, instead of the Pope. This had already been happening throughout Europe a bit, in places such as Hesse, but this kingdom was probably the biggest up to that point to join the Protestant Reformation. According to Diarmaid MacCulloch, Henry was, quote, the first king of Europe to fully do so, and that the Act, quote, spelt out without qualification the royal supreme headship over the Church of England. This was backed by Thomas Cromwell and Thomas Cranmer, among others. Cromwell, a staunch evangelical, further went on to dissolve the monasteries and inherit the chantry lands for the crown, which had once of course belonged to the Catholic Church. Unfortunately for him, he was executed in 1540 as a traitor and a heretic, as Henry of course disagreed with his theology, as Henry kind of liked a lot of the Catholic bits, bells and whistles and that. Cranmer was far luckier. Cranmer may have been a crafty politician, for the Act of Supremacy, quote, propelled him out of his previous conventional piety and distaste for Luther into hating the papacy and taking an interest in the Reformation's message, as well as how he later went back on this when he was trying to dodge execution at the hands of Mary in 1555, which of course failed. Before the Acts of Supremacy, England was relatively peaceful, but after the decision to split with the papacy, shit really hit the fan. There was a bunch of massive rebellions. The first of these was the Lincolnshire Rising of 1536, which lasted 2 weeks. Henry dispersed most of these people by telling them to leave or face the royal army, so most of them left. What remained was pacified and their ringleaders executed. This was followed by the biggest uprising of Henry's reign, and perhaps even of all of the Tudors, the Pilgrimage of Grace of 1536. This gigantic rising in Yorkshire erupted forth quickly, as the north has always been one of the more Catholic areas in England, in contrast to more Protestant areas in the southeast and East Anglia, where movements such as the Lollards have existed since the 14th century. This made Henry livid, expectedly, so he acted very differently from his father. He acted by, quote, deceiving the rebels with fake promises in what seemed to be their hour of triumph. He engineered the defeat. 40,000 people rose up in the pilgrimage, so Henry couldn't just crush them, so he acted reasonably towards them. Their leader, Robert Aske, tried negotiating with the king through his 24 articles, which was a list of demands. The first and foremost demand was the removal of Protestant heresy. Aske seems to have liked the king and started promoting the king in early 1537 in response to the king giving him a good reception of the terms, although no firm acceptance. This divided the rebels, as many saw him as a heretic for daring to oppose the Holy See. Taking advantage of this, Henry acted and crushed them. The reprisals were incredibly harsh, to the point where the punishment sowed the seeds of later dissatisfaction and was compared to the sack of Munster in the same year by MacCulloch. There were many other sub-rebellions within this, such as Big Odds Rebellion, which was beaten as well and the leader executed. Aside from the extent of the change of religion in England, there was a ton of other stuff happening. England went to war with France 3 times and invaded Scotland once. The first war with France was part of the War of the Leagues of Cambrai. Henry beat the French at the Battle of the Spurs with support from the Holy Roman Empire in early 1513. He also captured Tournai and Therouanne. After this, the Scots invaded England. Since Henry was in France, Catherine took command and beat the Scots so badly that amongst the dead was the king, James IV, at the Battle of Flodden. This was in October the same year, and in spite of being outnumbered, it's pretty safe to say that Catherine smashed the patriarchy that day. In spite of this, however, England lost the war since things went badly on the continent, but luckily peace meant for England status quo ante bellum, which basically meant they lost nothing. More on that in the continental bit. There was also war in the 1520s to support the Holy Roman Empire in the Italian Wars, but little seems to have happened on England's end. The final invasion of France in Henry's reign was in 1544, where England attacked and captured Boulogne. This was then returned to the French for a large sum of money. It's also important to note that Henry was reluctant to fully invade France, as he had already invaded Scotland. England was winning the War of Scotland, to the extent where they eventually forced the Scots to sign the Treaty of Greenwich in 1543, which was an attempt to bind the English and Scottish crowns together. This comes up later on in the next episode, as it provides a good pretext for Somerset to invade. The whole invasion of Scotland is generally known as the Rough Wooing. Aside from wars, religion and rebellion, some other things occurred during Henry's reign as well. I'm gonna dodge the whole divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived thing, since it's pretty much burned into the British collective consciousness, and if you're American you probably heard it as well. In short though, Mary was Catherine of Aragon's daughter, number 1 wife, Elizabeth was Anne Boleyn's daughter, number 2 wife, and Edward was Jane Seymour's son, number 3 wife. He was pretty terrible with finances, in stark contrast to his father as well. After all, the wars couldn't pay for themselves, and the suppressions of rebellions were not cheap either. He was also famously obese and loved the finer things in life too, which of course wasn't brilliant for his pocket. It also didn't help that he didn't update the prices, which were unchanged from 1485, and he also debased the currency. Debasing currency means to smelt coins that have less gold in them, hence reducing their value before the invention of modern fiat currency. This, of course, drove inflation further up. In short, Henry did some great things, but he seems to have caused some major problems further down the line. This culminated in what people tend to call the Mid-Tudor Crisis. Henry died in 1547 of being fat. The 100 years prior to 1547 are some of the most eventful in European history. Frankly, this video will not do it justice. One of the 2 most significant things to happen was the rise of the Ottomans in Europe. The people of Europe saw these Turks as, quote, like the plague of the Black Death. They were already present, ready to ravage God's people. Even before the big conquests that made them a threat to Europe at large, they still raided Eastern Europe with impunity, including Habsburg Hungary. This was about to get a heck of a lot worse though. In 1453, a young Mehmet II finally crushed the millennia-old Roman Empire by taking and sacking Constantinople, which was possible after crushing a crusade against him at the Battle of Varna in 1444. The details of the defence and sacking of Constantinople are fascinating, and I suggest you track them down and read them. However, since I don't want to make this 6 hours, I will simply put that Mehmet was brutal and destroyed so many treasures and defiled the centre of Orthodox Christianity. Previous to this, the Ottomans were conquering parts of the Balkans. In 1453, this included Bulgaria, parts of Greece, Macedonia, parts of Serbia, and other nations in the Balkan region. After the fall of Constantinople and the snuffing out of the last vestiges of true Rome, Mehmet focused on conquering Eastern Europe. He later went on to conquer Serbia, Morea, which is part of Greece, much of Anatolia, Bosnia, and the Romanian kingdoms of Wallachia and Moldavia. There was also a short war between the Venetians and the Ottomans, in which they gained control of Albania. He also made a couple of attempts on southern Italy. These conquests were furthered by Selim I and, more notably, Suleiman the Magnificent in the early 16th century. Selim annexed the Mamluk kingdom, which contained Egypt, the Levant, and parts of modern Saudi Arabia, including Mecca and Medina. This was bad on its own, but what made it so much worse was how Europe was throwing it as much as it could at them, and it was having little to no effect. Suleiman, however, could be a whole video to itself. Suleiman did a ton of stuff, which made the Ottomans Europe's worst nightmare. While Europe was in turmoil over the beginnings of the Protestant Reformation, Suleiman rode in and started conquering and consolidating the Ottomans' control over Europe. His first conquest, in 1522, was the small island of Rhodes. This was relatively easy since the Knights of Rhodes capitulated and moved to Malta. Then, he went to war with Hungary over Belgrade, and there was then an infamous battle at Mohacs, where King Louis of Hungary was killed. This pretty much led to Hungary being divided between the Ottomans and Habsburgs. The Habsburgs gained control over much of Croatia and northern Hungary, while the Ottomans got the rest of Hungary and a vassal in the form of Transylvania. After this, Suleiman tried to get further into Europe, Vienna in particular. However, although he did defeat the Habsburgs a few times, he failed in this endeavour. This, in addition to Ottoman conquests in Mesopotamia, Arabia, and North Africa, made the Ottomans the most powerful force present in Central Europe by the end of Suleiman's reign. The other menace that faced Europe was the Reformation. As we mentioned earlier on, in 1517 Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses to the door of a chapel in Saxony. While many reformers had existed before, such as the Albigensians, the Waldensians, and Lollards, Luther was by far the most successful of the lot. The Theses primarily attacked indulgences, which were payments to the Church to reduce a dead relative's time in purgatory, although the reason why he was successful was not down to what it was about. It was down to how it undermined the papacy, and that while it was being sent to the Pope, it was also circulated throughout the Holy Roman Empire too. This was due to the modern invention of the printing press. Luckily for him, his ideas led to his protection by German princes. You see, his ideas of defying the weak and corrupt Catholic Church appealed to many princes of the Holy Roman Empire, who were eyeing up church lands and saw it as a means to increase their power. This doesn't mention the insanity with the Church over the preceding centuries, where there were multiple popes, numerous heresies, and conflict between the Holy Roman Empire and the papacy. Simply put, Luther was a flashpoint to an issue that had been building up for literally 500 years. As the protection became more apparent, Luther became bolder. He published more works attacking salvation by works, transubstantiation, and even translating the Bible into German rather than the traditional Catholic Latin. Eventually, his works came to a head at the Council of Worms. We will elaborate upon this later, but the Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire at the time, Charles V, was extremely Catholic. Regardless, the Diet of Worms was a defeat for the Catholics. While afterwards, Luther was declared an outlaw and Charles wanted him dead as a heretic, he was very convincing and many of the princes of the empire internalized his ideas and agreed with him. Luckily, or unluckily perhaps, after he left the council, Luther was seized by Friedrich of Saxony and hidden so that he wasn't executed by the agents of the emperor. Regardless though, Pandora's box had opened, and the Holy Roman Empire and eventually the rest of Europe exploded, especially after Luther's translation of the Bible. Dozens of factions emerged very quickly, since many more people were now able to interpret the Bible for themselves. Anabaptists, Calvinists, Lutherans, Melchiorites, and other sects appeared over the next 20 years after the Council of Worms. There were numerous large-scale rebellions and league wars in the Holy Roman Empire too. Events such as the German Peasants' War in 1524 to 1526, the Knights' Revolt in 1522, and the Siege of Munster in the 1530s, while suppressed, tore the empire apart internally. Numerous princes, such as Philip of Hesse and John Frederick of Saxony, converted and eventually formed leagues, one of the earliest being the Schmalkaldic League, which eventually caused the Schmalkaldic League War in 1546 and 47, leading to the League's destruction. While the Catholics, and by extension the Habsburgs, remained dominant, it is safe to say this event split Europe in twain. Later on in the series, the schism will grow far deeper. The Habsburgs also grew massively throughout Europe too, as a result of strategic marriage and military might. In the 1440s, the Habsburgs essentially controlled the role of the Holy Roman Emperor and modern-day Austria. Although they originated from Switzerland, they had migrated due to being thrown off Swiss lands by the Swiss Confederates in the 14th century, with events such as the catastrophic defeat of the Habsburgs at the hands of Swiss peasants at Morgarten in 1315 and Sempach in 1386, as, quote, halberds, swung by the strong arms of an Alpine herdsman, would cleave helmet, shield, or coat of arms like pasteboard, and hence the Austrians were pushed out. However, what they were to inherit would make the loss of their Swiss holdings almost negligible. Bohemia, Silesia, Hungary, and Croatia went in and out of their control via personal union in the 15th century, formalising in the late 1520s. They gained control via personal union of the Burgundian kingdom as well, through Philip the Handsome. Their greatest leader, Charles V, was born in Burgundy too. Their largest gain prior to the start of the series was Castile-Aragon, which will be henceforth known as Spain, in 1504. The empire grew even stronger when Charles V gained power. Charles V, raised a very strong Catholic, led the Habsburg Empire at its height. Raised as a member and eventual Grand Master of the Knights of the Golden Fleece, Charles was rarely depicted without, quote, either this small golden ram or lamb, or the massive golden collar of the order. He saw himself as the man to unite Europe as a unified Catholic empire and to lead them against the world of heathens and heretics and show them the one true way. One way he did this was through the conquest of the New World. Discovered in 1492 by Columbus, the Habsburgs saw a brave new world full of souls to save. Hence, they sent violent and uncaring men like Pizarro and Cortes to conquer the lands and place them under the control of the Habsburgs. And guess what? That's exactly what they did.
The Aztec Empire fell in 1521, and the Inca fell in 1533. Hundreds upon thousands died, mostly of disease, but also at the hands of the cruelty of their Spanish overlords. This cruelty got to the point where Charles had to enforce laws to protect the natives. What this mostly did for the Habsburgs was make them incredibly rich, to the point where a significant proportion of England's war money came from raiding their ships, which brought the treasure back to Spain. Overall, Charles did a ton, and made the Habsburgs very strong outside of the period. There was also a bunch of other stuff that he did too, but since he didn't die until 1558, he will be mentioned in the second and third episode, so we won't conclude on him just yet. There was also a bunch of wars outside of these major things. The aforementioned War of the Leagues of Cambrai, notable for how the side the League declared war on switched sides to the people who initially declared war on them later in the war, was fought. In the end, some land changed hands, but not much else seems to have happened. There was also the Swedish War for Independence, which Sweden won. There was also the Italian Wars, where the states got screwed around by larger powers, as they had been for decades, and the French got wrecked so badly at one battle, the Battle of Pavia, that their own king was captured. There was also a large number of minor wars which you can look up, since they seem to have little bearing on the subject at hand, which I would like to remind people is the Tudors. So just quickly, we're going to talk about the structure of the series. You're obviously listening to the introduction, but here's some more details on later on in the series. The episodes I have planned are the following. The first one will be on Edward VI, which is from 1547 to 1553. The second will cover Mary I and Lady Jane Grey, which was 1553 to 1558. The third will be Elizabeth I, 1558 to 1572. The fourth will cover Elizabeth I again, 1572 till 1585. The fifth will be Elizabeth I, 1585 to 1603. And the last one will be a kind of a conclusion kind of thing. Each episode will cover the events in England in good detail and the continent in sparse detail. If you want detail on the continent with the French Wars of Religion or whatever, this isn't the series for you. However, if you want detail on the later Tudors, you have come to the right place. I aim to cover the period in a level of detail somewhere between hardcore history and extra credits. I believe that the whole series will be around 3-4 hours, kinda. So not the half an hour of extra credits, but neither the 25 hours of Hardcore History's World War I series. This should be good enough for any A-level or AP students, but I'm not too certain about undergraduate level. So either way, if you enjoyed, like and subscribe and all that. Comment if you have any queries or criticism or whatever. Dislike if you don't like it. Thanks for watching.